The community center in Portland sat quiet under the soft amber glow of streetlights, its brick walls worn smooth by years of rain and wind. Inside, past the echoing gymnasium and the empty art room with its drying paintbrushes, a single piano note rang out, clear, hesitant, then followed by another. The sound drifted down the hallway like a whisper that refused to fade. In the small rehearsal room at the end of the corridor, a 16-year-old girl sat hunched over an old upright piano, its wood scratched and its keys slightly yellowed with age. She wasn't practicing for fun. This was serious. In 3 weeks, she'd be on a stage in front of judges, critics, and maybe even a few scouts from music schools. It was her one shot, the kind of opportunity that didn't come twice. So she stayed late, long after the center's official closing time, because this was the only place she could afford to play without disturbing her neighbors or waking her little brother. Her fingers moved carefully over the keys, repeating a tricky passage again and again. Each time she got a little closer to nailing it. Just a hair smoother, just a touch more confident. She'd been working on Clara Schumann's Autumn Reverie for months, drawn to it not just because it was beautiful, but because it felt like a secret conversation between two people who'd never met. Her grandmother had taught it to her before she passed, saying, "This piece doesn't shout. It listens, and if you're honest with it, it'll answer back." Outside, the city hummed softly, cars passing, distant laughter from a late-night diner, the occasional bark of a dog. But inside, it was just her and the piano, the only companion she needed right now. Sweat gathered at her temples, not from heat, but from focus. She'd skipped dinner to rehearse, surviving on a granola bar and black coffee from the center's kitchenette. Her backpack sat by the door, stuffed with sheet music, a worn-out metronome, and a notebook filled with scribbled reminders. Slow the left hand, breathe before measure 27, don't rush the ending. She didn't notice the footsteps at first. They were firm, deliberate, echoing off the linoleum floor like someone used to being obeyed. By the time she heard them clearly, it was too late. The door swung open without a knock. A man stood in the doorway, tall, broad-shouldered, with silver hair combed neatly back and a navy overcoat buttoned all the way up. His face was sharp, lined with the kind of sternness that came from years of saying no and meaning it. He carried a leather briefcase in one hand and a look of deep irritation in his eyes. "You're past curfew," he said, voice low but cutting, like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath. The girl froze, hands hovering above the keys. Her heart thudded once hard against her ribs. She hadn't seen anyone else in the building for hours. I didn't think anyone was still here," she stammered, quickly standing up. "I'm just finishing up. 10 more minutes, maybe?" "No," he said flatly. "The center closes at 9. It's 9:23. You need to leave." She glanced at the wall clock. He was right. She'd lost track of time, as she often did when she played. "I'm sorry," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's just, I have a competition coming up. This is the only place I can practice without bothering anyone." "That's not my problem," he replied, stepping fully into the room. He set his briefcase down on a folding chair, his movements precise, controlled. "Rules are rules. You're disturbing the piece. I'm here to finalize paperwork for the building's non-profit status, and I can't do that with noise echoing through the halls." She swallowed. There was no arguing with that tone. It was the kind that shut doors, not opened them. She began gathering her things, folding her music carefully, zipping her backpack with trembling fingers. But as she passed the piano one last time, something made her pause. Maybe it was desperation, maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was just the quiet voice in her head that always whispered, "What if?" She turned back toward him. "Sir, do you know this piece?" He frowned, clearly annoyed by the question. "What piece?" Without waiting for permission, she sat back down. Her fingers found the opening notes, soft, melancholic, like leaves falling in slow motion. She played just the first 8 bars, nothing more, but it was enough. The man didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even blink. His briefcase slipped from his grip and landed on the floor with a dull thud. He stood there, rooted in place, as if the floor had turned to stone beneath his shoes. His jaw, which had been set in a hard line, went slack. His eyes, cold and assessing just moments before, suddenly looked distant, almost lost. The anger drained from his face like water from a cracked bowl, replaced by something raw and unguarded. She stopped playing. The last note hung in the air, trembling. For a long moment, neither of them said a word. The only sound was the faint hum of the overhead fluorescent light. Then, very quietly, he asked, "Where did you learn that?" His voice was different now, softer, cracked at the edges, like someone who hadn't used that tone in years. She hesitated. "My grandmother taught it to me. She said it was special, that it carried memories." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he walked slowly to the chair near the piano, the same one he'd dropped his briefcase on, and sat down heavily, as if his legs had suddenly forgotten how to hold him up. He stared at the piano, not at her, his hands resting on his knees, fingers slightly curled. "Play it again," he said, almost a whisper. She blinked. "All of it?" He nodded, still not looking at her. All of it, so she did. This time she didn't hold back. She let the music breathe, let it swell and sigh the way her grandmother had shown her. She played not for judges or scholarships, but for the silence in the room, for the man who suddenly seemed so much smaller than he had a few minutes ago. And as the melody filled the space, gentle, aching, full of longing, he closed his eyes. Outside, the city kept moving. But inside that little room, time slowed. The harsh lines of the judge's face softened. His shoulders, once rigid with authority, slumped slightly as if a great weight had been lifted or perhaps finally acknowledged. When she reached the final notes, she played them so softly they were almost imagined. Then silence returned, deeper this time, heavier with meaning. He opened his eyes. They were wet. "You play like she did," he said finally, voice rough. Exactly like her. She didn't know who she was, but she didn't need to ask. The pain in his voice said everything. "I'm sorry," she said gently. He shook his head. "Don't be. You gave me something I thought I'd never hear again." He stood slowly, brushing invisible dust from his coat, but he didn't tell her to leave. Didn't mention the curfew, didn't reach for his briefcase. Instead, he looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. "What's your name?" he asked. She told him. He nodded, as if filing it away somewhere safe. "Keep playing," he said. "Don't stop. Not for anyone." Then he turned and walked out, leaving his briefcase behind. She sat there for a long while, heart pounding not from fear now but from something else, something like hope. Or maybe the first note of a new beginning. Outside, the night stretched on, quiet and cool. But inside, the air felt different, lighter, as if the walls themselves had been listening and had decided to hold on to this moment for a little while longer. And though she didn't know it yet, this was only the start. The silence after the last note faded wasn't empty, it was full of questions, full of memories, full of something neither of them could name. The girl stayed seated at the piano, hands resting lightly on the keys, not daring to move. The man stood near the door, back turned, shoulders slightly hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. Neither spoke. The only sound was the soft ticking of an old wall clock somewhere down the hall. Then, slowly, he turned around. His eyes were red-rimmed now, not from anger but from something deeper, something that had been buried for a long time. He walked back toward the piano, not with the stiff authority he'd carried in earlier, but with the careful steps of someone stepping onto thin ice. "That piece," he said, voice low, "was the last thing she ever played for me." The girl didn't interrupt. She just listened. "She used to sit right where you are," he continued, gesturing to the bench. "Not this piano. Hers was a baby grand, old but beautiful, with ivory keys that turned yellow in the sun. She'd play in the evenings after work, sometimes with the windows open so the neighbors could hear. She believed music wasn't meant to be locked away. It was meant to be shared even if it hurt." He paused, swallowed hard, then sat down on the edge of the folding chair, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. "Her name was Eleanor," he said. "She was a music teacher at a high school downtown. Not famous, not rich, but everyone who heard her play said it felt like she was speaking directly to your soul. I never understood that until I met her. Then I did." The girl nodded slowly. "My grandmother said the same thing about music, that it's not about how fast or how loud you play, it's about what you leave behind in the silence." A faint smile touched his lips, the first real one she'd seen. "Eleanor would have liked you." He looked up then, really looked at her, not as a rule breaker, not as a nuisance, but as someone who'd stumbled into his life like a note out of an old song he thought he'd forgotten. "How did you come to learn Autumn Reverie?" he asked. It's not exactly on every beginner's playlist. She gave it to me, the girl said softly. My grandmother. She said Clara Schumann wrote it during a time of grief, after her husband died. But instead of falling apart, she read everything into that piece. Joy, sorrow, hope all tangled together. Grandma said it was like listening to someone heal in real time. He exhaled slowly, as if releasing a breath he'd been holding for decades. Eleanor played it the night before she went into the hospital for the last time. She knew, I think. She didn't say it outright, but she played it like a goodbye. I didn't realize it then. I was too busy being practical, making calls, arranging appointments, pretending everything would be fine. I told her to rest, not to tire herself. She just smiled and said, "Music isn't tiring. It's breathing." His voice cracked on the last word. He looked away, blinking fast. The girl didn't offer empty comfort. She didn't say, "I'm sorry for your loss," like people often did, as if those words could patch up a lifetime of missing someone. Instead, she reached out and gently pressed a single key, middle C, letting the note hang in the air like an offering. He looked back at her, surprised. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to," she said. "But if you do, I'll listen, like the music does." Something in him seemed to loosen then, not all at once, but like a knot slowly coming undone. "I spent 30 years on the bench," he said after a while. "Judge, people called me ruthless and said I had no mercy. Maybe they were right. After she died, I shut everything out, music, friends, even holidays. I told myself it was discipline. That grief was a luxury I couldn't afford. But really, I was just afraid. Afraid that if I let myself feel it, I'd never stop." He ran a hand over his face. "I haven't listened to piano music in over 20 years. Not on the radio, not in movies, not even in elevators. I'd change the channel, walk out of rooms. It hurt too much. And tonight, I came here to sign papers, to do a favor for a friend, and I heard that melody, and for a second I thought I was back in our living room, watching her play in that old blue dress she loved." His voice trailed off. The girl didn't speak. She just sat with him in that quiet ache, letting it exist without trying to fix it. After a long pause, he asked, "What's your story? Why are you here so late, alone, playing like your life depends on it?" She hesitated, then told him. Her parents worked double shifts, her mother at a hospital, her father driving a delivery truck. They'd saved for years to buy her a second-hand keyboard when she was 10. She practiced on it until the keys stuck, until the sound became tinny and thin. When she outgrew it, the community center became her sanctuary. Free access, decent acoustics, and a piano that, while old, still had a soul. The competition. "It's not just about winning," she explained. "It's about a scholarship. Full ride to a summer conservatory. If I get in, maybe I can audition for a music school next year. My parents, they'd never say it, but I know they worry. They want me to study something safe, nursing, accounting, something with a steady paycheck. And I get it. But when I play, it's the only time I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." He listened intently, nodding now and then, his earlier sternness completely gone. "Eleanor used to say that too," he murmured. "That music wasn't a career, it was a calling. And you don't ignore a calling no matter how hard it is." They talked for over an hour, not just about music, but about fear, about pressure, about the strange way loss could shape a person without breaking them, if they let it. He told her how Eleanor used to laugh at his terrible attempts to hum along, how she'd leave little notes in his briefcase before big court cases. Be fair, but be kind. She told him about her little brother, who'd fallen asleep to her practicing since he was a baby, and how he now hums classical melodies in his sleep. At one point, he stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street. "I haven't felt this present in years," he admitted. "Not since she left. It's like I've been going through the motions, checking boxes, keeping busy so I wouldn't have to feel empty. But tonight, when you played, that emptiness filled with something else. Not joy exactly, but peace," she smiled. "That's what the peace is supposed to do." He turned back to her. "You're good. Really good. Not just technically, though you've clearly worked hard, but you play with heart." "That's rare." "Thank you," she said, cheeks warming. "But I still mess up the transition in the second movement. Every time." "Then let's fix it," he said, surprising them both. She blinked. "You want to help me practice?" He gave a small shrug. "I'm no teacher, but I've listened to that piece more times than I can count, and I know what it's supposed to feel like. So she played it again, this time with him sitting close enough to see her hands. He didn't interrupt, didn't correct her like a coach might. Instead, he'd say things like, "Slow down here. Let the sadness breathe." Or, "That part should sound like sunlight breaking through clouds." Try it lighter. It wasn't instruction. It was conversation between her, the piano, and the ghost of a woman neither of them had met, but who somehow connected them. When she finally nailed the tricky passage, the one she'd been wrestling with for weeks, she let out a small laugh of disbelief. "I did it." He actually smiled, a real one this time, warm and quiet. "You did." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the kind that only comes when two people have shared something honest. Then he checked his watch and sighed. "It's nearly midnight. You should head home." She nodded, gathering her things again, but this time without the rush or fear. As she zipped her bag, she glanced at him. "Will you be back?" He hesitated, then nodded. "I think I will. Maybe I could play for you again sometime?" "I'd like that," he said. "But next time, let's not wait until you're breaking curfew." She laughed softly. "Deal!" As she walked out into the cool night air, she felt lighter, as if something inside her had shifted. Not just because she'd improved a passage, but because someone had truly heard her. Not just the notes, but the person behind them. Back in the rehearsal room, the man stood alone for a long time. He picked up his briefcase, but instead of leaving right away, he walked over to the piano. He didn't play. He hadn't touched a key in decades, but he ran his fingers lightly over the wood, as if greeting an old friend. Then he pulled a small, worn notebook from his coat pocket, the kind judges used to jot down observations during trials. He flipped to a blank page and wrote 2 words in careful script. Autumn Reverie. He didn't know why. Maybe to remember. Maybe to begin. Outside, the girl turned the corner, her footsteps echoing softly on the sidewalk. She hummed a few bars of the melody as she walked, not loudly, just enough to keep it alive in the night. And somewhere behind her, in a quiet room with an old piano, a man who hadn't cried in 20 years let a single tear fall onto the keys. Silent, slow and full of grace, the city slept on, unaware of the small miracle that had just unfolded in a forgotten corner of a community center. But the music remained, lingering in the walls, in the air, in 2 hearts that had just begun to heal, separately, and now together. The next Thursday evening, the girl arrived at the community center exactly at 8, 10 minutes before closing time, just to be safe. She carried her backpack, a thermos of tea her mother had insisted she take, and a new notebook with fresh sheet music tucked inside. Her heart beat a little faster than usual as she walked down the familiar hallway. She wasn't sure if he'd really come back. People said a lot of things in emotional moments, promises made in the heat of feeling that faded by morning. But part of her hoped, and that part kept her coming. She pushed open the rehearsal room door and stopped. He was already there, sitting in the same folding chair, briefcase at his feet, coat neatly draped over the back. He looked up when she entered, and though his expression was still reserved, there was a softness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "You came," he said. "So did you," she replied, smiling. He gave a small nod. "I kept my word." She set her things down and sat at the piano. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he asked, "How's the second movement?" "Better," she said. "I practiced it every day this week. Even on my keyboard at home, though it's not the same." "It never is," he said quietly. "A real piano breathes. Yours just echoes," she laughed softly. "That's exactly how it feels." He leaned forward slightly. "Play it for me, from the beginning." She did. This time she wasn't nervous. There was no competition looming in her mind, no fear of being caught after hours. She played for him, for the man who listened like every note mattered. And as she played, she noticed something new. He didn't just hear the music. He felt it. His fingers tapped lightly on his knee in time with the rhythm. His shoulders relaxed during the softer passages. Once, during a particularly tender phrase, he closed his eyes and tilted his head slightly, as if catching a scent on the wind. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You're holding back in the climax," he finally said. "Not technically, you're hitting all the right notes. But you're afraid to let it roar." She frowned. "I don't want to sound harsh." "Clara Schumann wasn't writing a lullaby," he said gently. "She was writing grief. And grief isn't always quiet. Sometimes it shouts. Sometimes it breaks things. But even then, it's honest, she thought about that. Then she placed her hands back on the keys and tried again, this time letting the music swell, letting her fingers press deeper, letting the piano sing with all its strength. The room filled with sound, rich, powerful, aching. When she reached the end, her chest was rising and falling quickly, as if she'd run a race. He didn't applaud. But he smiled. Now that, he said, was truth. After that, it became a ritual. Every Thursday night, rain or shine, he'd be there by 8. Sometimes he brought a paper cup of black coffee. Once he brought a small box of shortbread cookies. Eleanor's favorite, he'd said, offering her one without explanation. She took it, and they ate in silence, the sweetness lingering on her tongue long after. They never talked about courtrooms or rulings or the reputation he'd built over decades. He never mentioned being a judge unless she asked, and even then he'd shrug and say that was a different life. Instead, they talked about music, about how certain chords could make your throat tighten, about how silence between notes was just as important as the notes themselves, about how a single melody could carry the weight of a lifetime. One night she asked him, did she ever perform in public? He nodded. Small recitals, school events. She hated big stages, said they made music feel like a performance, not a gift. But once, just once, she played at a benefit concert downtown. I sat in the very back row. I still remember what she wore, a simple green dress, her hair pinned up. And when she played, the whole room went still, like everyone had forgotten to breathe. He paused, looking at his hands. Afterward, a woman came up to me crying. She said, tell her thank you. I haven't felt peace like that since my son died. Eleanor never knew. I never told her. I thought it would make her nervous. Now I wish I had. The girl was quiet for a moment. Then she said maybe she knew anyway. Maybe that's why she played the way she did. He looked at her, surprised. Then he nodded slowly. Maybe you're right. As the weeks passed, their conversations grew deeper. She told him about the pressure she felt, not just from the competition, but from the quiet worry in her parents' eyes whenever she talked about music school. They're proud, she said, but they're scared for me. They came here with nothing. They want me to have security. And I get that. But sometimes I feel like I'm choosing between making them happy and being true to myself. He listened without judgment. Then he said, Eleanor's parents wanted her to be a secretary. Steady work, they said. No heartbreak. But she told them, if I don't play, my heart will break anyway. They didn't understand. But they let her try. Did it work out? She asked. He smiled faintly. She never became famous. Never toured the world. But she taught hundreds of kids how to listen, not just to music, but to themselves. And every one of them carries a piece of her. That's not failure. That's legacy. She thought about that all the way home. The competition was now just 10 days away. She'd submitted her application, recorded her audition tape, and received confirmation that she'd been accepted to perform live. The venue was a historic theater downtown. Grand, intimidating, with velvet seats and a Steinway grand on stage. The thought of playing there made her stomach twist. One evening, as she practiced a new piece, a fiery Chopin nocturne, he watched silently. When she finished, he said, "You're ready." She shook her head. "I don't feel ready." "Nobody does," he said. "Not really. But readiness isn't about feeling sure. It's about showing up anyway." She looked at him. "What if I mess up?" "Then you'll be human," he said simply, "and the people who matter will still hear you." He stood up then, walked to the window and stared out at the dark street. "I used to think strength was never showing weakness. That's what the courtroom taught me. But Eleanor, she taught me that real strength is letting yourself be seen. Flaws, fears, all of it. That's what makes music powerful. Not perfection, honesty." She didn't say anything. She just absorbed his words like rain soaking into dry ground. Then, out of nowhere, he turned to her and said, "I'll be there." She blinked. "At the competition?" "Yes, but you don't even like crowds." "I don't," he admitted, "but I'll sit in the back. Like I did for her. And I'll listen." Her eyes stung. She looked down at the keys, blinking fast. "Thank you." He didn't make a big deal of it. Just nodded and said, "Now let's work on your tempo in the coda. You're rushing again." They spent the next hour fine-tuning, laughing once when she hit a wrong note so loudly it made them both jump. It was the first time she'd ever heard him laugh. a low, rumbling sound like distant thunder. It surprised them both. Later, as she packed up, she asked, "Why are you doing this?" "Helping me, I mean." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Because you reminded me that beauty still exists. And because maybe I needed to hear that song again. Not just for her. For me." She understood. On her way out, she paused at the door. "Will you come next week too?" He looked at the piano, then back at her. "Every week," he said. "As long as you're playing," she smiled. "Then I'll keep playing." Outside, the night air was cool and crisp. She walked home under a sky full of stars, her fingers still tingling from the keys, her heart full in a way she couldn't explain. She didn't know what would happen at the competition. She didn't know if she'd win or if it would change her life. But for the first time, that didn't feel like the point. The point was the music, the connection, the quiet understanding between two people who'd found each other through a melody no one else seemed to remember. And somewhere behind her, in a dimly lit room with an old piano, a man who'd spent years building walls around his heart sat alone for a few more minutes, listening to the echo of her playing in his mind. Soft, steady, and full of hope. He didn't leave right away. He just stayed, letting the silence settle around him like a blanket. For the first time in a long time, the quiet didn't feel empty. It felt like peace, and that was enough. The week before the competition, everything changed. It started with a simple offer. Spoken so casually, the girl almost missed it. They were in the rehearsal room as usual. Thursday night, 8 o'clock, rain tapping softly against the windows. She'd just finished running through her entire program, fingers aching but heart light. He sat in his usual chair, eyes closed during the final notes, as if savoring the last drop of something precious. When the music ended, he opened his eyes and said, "You shouldn't be practicing on this piano anymore." She froze. "Why, did I do something wrong?" He shook his head quickly. "No, not at all. It's just, this old thing can't give you what you need now. The action is sluggish, the tone's uneven. You deserve better, especially with the competition so close." She looked down at the keys, running a finger over a chipped edge. "I know it's not perfect, but it's all I've got." He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small key on a plain metal ring. "There's a place downtown," he said. "An arts academy. They have a Steinway B and a private studio, tuned weekly, climate-controlled, the whole thing. I serve on their advisory board. I can get you access." Her eyes widened. "But that's for students, right? Professionals? They make exceptions," he said simply. "And I've already spoken to the director. You can rehearse there every evening after 6 as long as you need. Just show up, use the key, lock up when you leave." She couldn't believe it. "You did that for me?" He shrugged, but there was a flicker of something warm in his expression. "Consider it an investment. In honesty and beauty. In you." She didn't know what to say. "Thank you," she finally managed, voice thick. "I don't know how to repay you." "You already have," he said, "by playing that song." The next evening, she stood outside the Arts Academy, a sleek, modern building with tall glass windows and a quiet dignity about it. She felt out of place in her worn jacket and scuffed shoes, but she held the key tightly and walked in. The studio was everything he'd said, and more. The piano gleamed under soft lighting, its black finish reflecting the room like a still pond. When she pressed a key, the sound bloomed instantly, clear, resonant, alive. She played a scale, then a chord, then a full phrase from her piece, and tears pricked her eyes. It was like hearing her own voice for the first time. She practiced there every night. The space was empty, peaceful, and hers alone. No curfews, no interruptions, just her and a piano that responded to every nuance of her touch. She worked harder than ever, refining dynamics, polishing transitions, letting the music breathe in ways she never could before. But something was missing. It wasn't the piano. It was him. She missed his quiet presence, the way he'd lean forward when a passage moved him, the small nods of approval, the rare but genuine smiles. She missed the way he listened, not just with his ears, but with his whole being. The new studio was perfect, but it felt lonely. On Thursday, she went back to the community center anyway. He was there. He didn't seem surprised to see her. Just looked up from his coffee and said, "I wondered if you'd come." "I miss this," she admitted, sitting at the old piano. "The new place is amazing, but it doesn't feel like home." He smiled faintly. "Home isn't always the fanciest place. Sometimes it's just where you're heard." She played for him then, not her competition pieces but a simple folk melody her grandmother used to hum. He listened with his eyes closed, head tilted slightly the way he always did. Afterward, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out an envelope. "This arrived today," he said, handing it to her. She opened it carefully. Inside was a check, enough to cover the competition entry fee, travel, and even a new dress for the performance. At the bottom, in neat handwriting, was a note, "For the music." She looked up, stunned. "I can't take this." "You already did," he said gently. "The moment you played that song, you gave me something money can't buy. Let me give you this." She didn't argue. She just folded the check carefully and tucked it into her notebook, her throat tight. Then he did something unexpected. He stood, walked to the piano, and sat beside her on the bench, close but not touching. "Show me the part you're still struggling with," he said. She pointed to a passage in the Chopin, fast, intricate, full of leaps that always made her stumble. He studied the sheet music for a moment, then said, "Try it slower. Not just the tempo, your mind. You're thinking 3 notes ahead, but your hands are still on the first. Be here now." She tried it, and this time it flowed. He didn't teach her like a piano instructor. He taught her like someone who understood that music wasn't just in the fingers. It was in the breath, the heartbeat, the silence between thoughts. Over the next few days, he began coming to the Arts Academy too. Not every night, but often enough that she'd look up from the keys and see him standing quietly in the doorway, briefcase in hand, watching. He never interrupted, just listened. Sometimes he'd stay for an hour, sometimes just 10 minutes, but his presence was a kind of anchor. One evening, as she practiced the final moments of Autumn Reverie, he walked in and stood by the window, arms crossed. When she finished, he said, "You've changed it." She frowned. "Changed it how?" "You've added something." A little hesitation before the last chord, like you're reluctant to let go. She hadn't even realized she'd done it. "I guess I am. This piece feels like a bridge, between her and me, between you and her. I don't want it to end." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Maybe it doesn't have to." She looked at him. "Music doesn't end when the last note fades," he said. "It lives in the people who carry it. You're not ending anything. You're passing it on." She nodded slowly, understanding. The day before the competition, she couldn't sleep. Her stomach churned. Doubt crept in like fog. What if she froze on stage? What if she forgot the notes? What if all this effort meant nothing? She texted him, something she'd never done before, just 2 words. "I'm scared." He replied within minutes. So was she. She played anyway. That was all she needed. The next afternoon, she arrived at the historic theater downtown. Backstage was a blur of nervous energy. Other performers warming up, parents whispering encouragement, stagehands moving silently in black clothes. She found a quiet corner and closed her eyes, breathing deeply. Then she saw him. He stood near the back exit, coat buttoned, hands in his pockets, looking slightly out of place among the crowd. But his eyes found hers immediately. He gave a small, firm nod. She nodded back. It was enough. Back in the green room, she changed into the simple navy dress she'd bought with part of his gift. It wasn't flashy, just clean lines, soft fabric, nothing to distract from the music. She ran her fingers over the fabric and thought of Eleanor's blue dress, and how music wasn't about show. It was about soul. When her name was called, she walked onto the stage. The lights were bright. The audience was a sea of shadowed faces. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure they could hear it. Then she saw him, in the very back row, just like he'd said. Sitting alone, hands folded, watching, she sat at the piano, placed her hands on the keys, took one deep breath and began. She didn't play for the judges. She didn't play for the scholarship. She played for the woman who'd once played this song as a goodbye. She played for the man who'd spent 20 years running from that memory. She played for her grandmother, for her parents, for every late night in that old community center. Most of all, she played for herself. The music poured out, clear, honest, full of everything she'd learned, everything she'd felt. In the second movement, she let it roar. In the quiet parts, she let it ache. And in the final notes, she added that tiny hesitation, not out of fear, but out of love. When she finished, the silence lasted a heartbeat too long. Then the applause came, warm, steady, real. She stood, bowed, and walked off stage without looking back. Backstage, she leaned against a wall, trembling, not from nerves now, but from release. A stagehand handed her a small envelope. "For you," he said. Inside was a single sheet of paper. On it, in familiar handwriting, were 2 words, "Well done." She clutched it to her chest and smiled. Later, outside the theater, she found him waiting under a street lamp. "You were magnificent," he said simply. She shook her head. "I just played." "No," he said. "You spoke, and everyone heard." They walked together for a few blocks in comfortable silence. Then he stopped and turned to her. "Whatever happens with the results, you've already won." She knew he was right. The next morning, a local news reporter called the community center, having heard a rumor about a retired judge and a young pianist sharing a musical moment. They wanted an interview, maybe a photo. She called him to ask what to do. He laughed, a real warm laugh. "Tell them no. This wasn't for cameras. It was for us," she did. A few days later, he showed up at the community center with a man in a suit and 2 workers carrying blueprints. "What's going on?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he led her to the rehearsal room and pointed to the old piano. "This place needs a proper instrument," he said. "One that won't hold anyone back." She stared at him. "You're donating a piano?" "In Eleanor's name," he said. "A grand. For anyone who needs a place to be heard." She didn't cry, but her eyes shone. The workers measured the room. The man in the suit took notes, and the girl stood in the doorway, watching the beginning of something beautiful. That evening, as the sun set, she played one last time on the old upright, just a few notes of autumn reverie. Then she closed the lid gently. "It served us well," he said, standing beside her. "It did," she agreed. They didn't say goodbye, because they both knew they'd be back. And every Thursday after that, if you passed the community center late at night, you might hear it, the sound of a new piano, rich and clear, filling the room with music. And if you listened closely, you'd hear 2 voices in it, one young, one old, playing not just notes but healing, hope, and the quiet miracle of being found when you least expect it.